Hello, I'd like to welcome you to the discussion of my book, A Guide to, Hiking the Liberal Arts, the Washington College Kipling Hall program. I'd like to begin by sort of outlining some of the parameters of life at Kipling Hall and life in our program. To begin with, Kipling Hall is the ancestral home of the Calvert family who founded the colony of Maryland and subsequently the state of Maryland. Washington College is the 10th oldest college in the country and the oldest one in Maryland. And so there seemed to be a kind of natural affinity between the historic connections between the state and Washington College. We, beginning in 2018, my wife Barbara and I were allowed to develop a program that involved living at the study center at Kipling Hall. And the idea that we had as an overarching idea was that we wanted to have the students engage with the various landscapes of northern England, the Lake District, the North York Moors, the cliffs of along the North Sea and the coast of Yorkshire, and to study the poets and the writers, novelists who wrote about the area, and to provide students with the access to having their own experiences in landscapes that were written about by people like Wordsworth or Coleridge or Charlotte and Emily Bronte, among others. Again, the idea was to have their experience and the literary experience of reading the material. We also wanted them to engage with the natural world. The areas, I should say, of North Yorkshire and the Lake District are particularly beautiful areas, and to enforce or to enhance the time that we were in England. Initially, it was a 3-week stay in England. Later, it became a 2-week stay and 1 week in Ireland. But it happened that the internet connections at Kipling Hall were not all that good. So students, by the nature of things, couldn't access their phones and couldn't access the world outside, so to speak, in the preferred way these days through computers and through phones. So they were kind of in a situation where they had to learn about getting along without the electronics. It's not that I'm a troglodyte and against all kinds of electronic innovation, but it is functionally useful to find a space where you're not intruded upon by the electronic facts of life in the 21st century. In any case, in order to keep expenses down, my wife and I drove vans, and that helped a lot in terms of the cost. We also did all of our own food preparation, shopping and preparing food for what was generally between 12 and 16 students. The students as went with us to the store to get supplies. We provided a local kind of running joke for several years. When Tesco opened up in North Allerton, we would go in and my wife would give each of the students a list of things that she wanted them to get. So groups of 4 students at a time would go through the store very quickly, pick up what was needed, and then would all meet at the cash register and check out. As we were checking out, it became a kind of thing locally to take bets on how much the bill would be. And people would kind of cheer on if they came in pretty close. Anyway, I was glad to be a good neighbor at the time. The students that participated came from different majors. We had students who were chemistry majors, biology majors, business, as well as English, history, art. And students came from different colleges. As if we had available room, we would take students from other colleges. So we had students from Swarthmore and Wellesley, Connecticut, and Loyola, among others. So we all had very clear intention about what we were about to do, that was hike every day into these various landscapes. Many of the students were not that physically active, but they became pretty physically active. But let me just read you one of the early passages about my own belief and the belief shared by Barbara, and that is this. The opportunity to develop a program in England pushed me into thinking about the value and purpose of a college education and the importance of English as a discipline. The situation called to mind passages from the Prelude as Wordsworth contemplated the course of his life, and Wordsworth says, "And in the sheltered grove where I was couched, a perfect stillness, on the ground I lay passing through many thoughts, yet mainly such as to myself pertained." Finding stillness and having time and a place to focus on discovering the meaning of ourselves in our very hectic 21st century life became a goal for my sense of the program. As ideas about the prospective program became clear in my mind, I established as a prevailing principle that my purpose was to move students through their reading of poems and link the literature we would study with specific sites that we had to reach on foot and with varying degrees of difficulty. Combining physical exertion and poetry, I believed, would allow students unique ways of understanding what they felt and thought. The emotional context I wanted was joy. The physical challenges of hiking and climbing would be difficult, but the satisfaction of completing each day's experiences in a supportive group, I believe, would lead to joy in personal satisfaction. Learning takes place best in a positive environment. Understanding poetry requires concentration, open-mindedness, precision, cultural and historical awareness, and imagination. Physical exertion demands discipline, willpower, awareness, and imagination. Physical exertion demands discipline, willpower, confidence, and physical fortitude. The elements of each part of my goal I conceived as being complementary. I wanted them to go where poetry goes, taking them to new perceptions and new ways of understanding their experience and how they read poetry. By studying and experiencing poetry along with the demands of hiking in various landscapes, searching for connections between the natural world and the poems they would read, I believed would reach the particular level of understanding the knowledge derived from poetry and their physical effort, fusing their unique experiences. Ambition about my high hopes for the program led me in time to consider the larger issue of the liberal arts. By describing the Kipling Hall program, what we have done, I hope illustrates the essence of what liberal arts embody. As the program would begin each year, we wanted the students to engage with a mountain experience. And the mountain that we chose that we thought was most accessible and at the same time providing a challenge was a place called Helm Crag, and that's just outside of Grasmere, fairly close in fact. And so we would hike into that landscape with a great deal of enthusiasm. The students were very much engaged with the idea of getting to the top. So in this section from that chapter, I talk about having gotten to a certain level and what occurred. The peak is not visible, but that is no matter, as all of our attention is riveted on what is directly in front of us. A labyrinth of rocks has us continually looking for safe places to plant our increasingly banged up feet while looking forward in quick snatches like an over-caffeinated chess player, using our hands and arms as well as our feet, moving crab-like brings a kind of giddy laughter to some, while others are daunted by fears of falling. My walking sticks become a nuisance in this section of the mountain, and as I try to join Barbara, who is coaching reluctant students forward, I become the object lesson in awkwardness by catching my shins on every available rock, along with spasmodic lurches in all directions. The students follow Barbara's advice and avert their eyes from my rattletrap movements. Arriving at the summit is transformative. I am always gratified by the way that students who had the most difficult time hiking up find an excitement that is communicated by laughter and often tears. With the wind slashing at each of us like a rebuff to go away, the group-wide awareness of accomplishment makes everyone feel curiously relaxed. The uncertainty for many who had never even thought of climbing a mountain finds relief and is replaced by an exalted understanding of their capabilities, belief in themselves, and a sharpened understanding of how the will can be directed toward achieving what it seemed insurmountable will come to them as letters from former students in past attest, but not now. We learn in the process of unfolding. Sometimes it takes years before we truly understand what our experiences mean. And so it is with regard to what we feel on a way toward. One of the signal events each year was a climb in a place called Langdale Pike. It wasn't the highest mountain, but it always proved to be the most difficult, and for a variety of reasons. The landscape itself was challenging, but the weather was always changeable, and it could move from bright sun to rain to hail, back to bright sun, and so forth. And it always was something that we thought was challenging, but at the same time a little scary. I'm picking up one of the expeditions up Langdale Pike here, and what's going on in this section is that there was a young woman who was having great difficulty climbing. She was big and overweight, and at the same time very, very determined to do what everyone else is doing. And I developed an admiration for her willpower. In any case, we were at the summit feeling very kind of giddy at having arrived, only to have that changed very, very quickly as clouds rolled in, and then hail started slashing at us, and it became very difficult to get past the raking of the hail. Trying to see was a little bit of a difficulty, more than just a little bit actually. So each person picked his or her way, progressing at a glacial pace. Glacial seems appropriate and ironic at the same time. The woman having difficulty on the climb was suffering much more at this point. My waterproof jacket proved not to be, and I was soaked through and feeling deeply chilled almost immediately. As each member of the group came toward me and went on, I could see that they too were drenched, though their faces remained impassive. Barbara was with the woman at the back of the group, and I knew that her progress was going to be very slow, making the other members of the group colder as they would have to wait for her. I gathered the lead group together and told them that they should continue on. The trail was very obvious from the point where we were. They would await at the Sticklebarn pub for us at the bottom of the mountain. Like birds freed from a cage confinement, they strode off immediately in a small burst of energy. As I watched them descend, the increasing coldness in my body made me want to join them. However, I waited for Barbara and the woman to reach me. The woman, seeing others descending at a soldier's pace, began crying. Her mud-soaked boots, saturated clothing, and trembling begged for sympathy and commiseration. Both feelings I had for her in excess, but sympathy was not going to get her down. Nothing but her own willpower and resolve would work. There were no mountain services with brawny men able to pick her up and carry her down. Given the weather conditions, a helicopter rescue was out of the question. She had never done anything remotely connected to the kind of physical activity we were doing, even though students are told before the program begins that they have to be in good physical shape to succeed in the hikes. Nevertheless, we had to move. Looking downward in the direction where I knew the trail led, I longed to be where I could not see. My body was rebelling. My shaking hands served as a counterpoint to the twitching in my upper body and the shiver in my legs. My feet were wet to numbness. I did not know where my limit would be, but I suspected that I was nearing that unwanted discovery rapidly. Discomfort and exasperation caused by inertia flared anger into my chest. I could feel my self-control slipping. Fortunately, I did not say anything, held back primarily by the insistence of the still shredding hail. Fighting to make eye contact with the woman in the hope of getting her to move on, I blinked away some melted hail in my eyes and caught sight of her clearly as she went down in the fast-running water underfoot. She was giving up with no sense of what she was doing. Looking at her in the mud and the water melted my exasperation and momentary anger. In obvious pain and giving in to the maliciousness of our circumstances, she was abandoning hope. Barbara quickly ordered her to stand up, stop crying, and move on, she said. The commanding tone of Barbara's voice seemed to reach deep into the student's sensibilities, and she did what she was told to do. I had renewed visions of sustained movement downward to dry warmth. Hope rose. My fantasy dissipated in no time. The woman was up but barely moving. Barbara and I took turns staying next to her or leading her by pointing to each place she needed to place her foot. Foot by foot and step by step we were coming down. Water-soaked creases spiderwebbed her jacket. Her legs, mud-splattered to the knees and bedraggled hair falling out from her hood, gave her the air of bewilderment. After an hour, the pelting hail switched to a driving rain, but now I could see a bench that was placed some years ago in memory of a longtime resident of the area. Many times in the past we had passed that bench in warm, sunny weather, and for a few moments I lost myself to daydreams about warm and hot days we have spent on this mountain. The severe discomfort and combination of frustration at the slowness of our progress and my heartfelt sympathy for the woman led to reflections about the way different emotions strain to wrench us in one direction or the other at the same time. Thoughts about the sense of feeling how sensation creates emotional states became a way of detaching myself from what I was feeling, both sensually and emotionally, at this time, and opened a way of understanding something essential about learning. Simply put, it had to feel right, just as we talk in terms of gut feelings or being rubbed the wrong way. Really knowing something carried an emotional commitment. For now, I just wish I could feel less wet and cold. I could not deny my real feelings of enervating cold in my bones and anger at the cause of them, and my fundamental concern for this woman who was pushing the limits of all that she had ever experienced physically, and as far as I could discern, emotionally as well. I really wanted to just leave her on one hand because of my own pain, yet for moral, ethical, and emotional reasons, I could never do that. The ache in my deeply cold legs at this point settled into my knees and made each step an exclamation point of pain, acknowledging yet another completed step. Dungeon Gill's consistent roar deflected my self-centered thoughts for a while. How wonderful it is, I thought, that distractions can subdue our anxieties. The change of focus shifted my languishing hope to a brighter place. Throughout the descent, each of us slipped many times. It was impossible not to, with hail-glazed rocks higher up and moss-laden stones partially submerged by the now constantly falling rain, threatening every footplant. Elbows, knees, and shins provided target points to be bashed at each slip and fall. Oh, ow, ah! rose into the saturated air like a chorus reduced to guttural noises. 2 hours had passed since I sent the rest of the students down, and the stretch of trail I recounted the climb and especially the descent. Shamed at my thoughts of anger for being held up so long by the student who was by now walking steadily on the largely even trail, I thought about her and what she had accomplished. At the moment, I was too cold and wet to talk or even think clearly. I just wanted to get indoors. Throughout the ordeal, Barbara was a rock. She spoke calmly and encouragingly to the woman and convinced her that she would succeed. Her care was genuine, and her own discomfort was never an issue. She held her hand and coaxed her on. Several times in my own cold frustration, I asked her if she was okay or if she wanted to descend, and I would stay with the student. Her clear-faced look, enhanced by a stare, was unmistakable. She suggested that I might want to go down, but she was remaining. Arriving at the base of the mountain, she showed no outward signs of cold, in contrast to my jitterbug movements with my body in full rebellion. The group that descended earlier was well warmed by this time and joyful for our arrival. I sat by the open hearth fire for over an hour, absorbing as much heat as I could in my slowly steaming and drying clothes. My reflections were on the woman. I did not want to talk. I needed to think. Conditions this day for a group were worse than I had ever experienced. The surprise slashing of hail welted at our faces to the point where trying to see provoked a disorienting loss of balance. Picking our way through the scattered boulders and icing as we moved on a descending incline that is challenging in good weather was unique in my experience and frightening. The young woman had to be terrified given her inexperience, yet she found something deep within herself to goad her onwards. Much of the way down, her face contorted in rictus, she was flat out, beyond her entire realm of previous emotion and physical experience. She was courageous. The courage that she mustered was connected to circumstances. Surely she would never forget her climb today for all the physical pain. But more importantly, I believe that she would also know that her discovery of fortitude and courage in the face of significant difficulty will continue to shape her existence. During the rest of her college career, when I would meet her on campus, she acknowledged the life-changing experience that came to her on Langdale Pike. Her success made me feel very proud of her and disgraced at my own self-concern for warmth and relief. There are many incidents of, I would say, fortitude, at times heroism. They were not always as dangerous as I outlined in this section, but there were. I think the sum total was that the interior strength that the students found helped them. I don't think just only in the, let's say, the physical sense of climbing a mountain, but I think it helped them to develop a kind of fortitude that allowed them to push through difficult works of literature, to think more, should we say, emotionally, to carry with them the idea that emotion shapes who we are, what we do. While we stayed in England for 2 weeks, the last week of the program was spent in Ireland, and we lived in a place called Glengarriff, which is just on the edge of Bantry Bay, way to the south, at the very base of West Cork. And there we lived in small cottages that were exactly the kind of thing we needed. And we did essentially the same kind of thing in Ireland that we did in England. That is, we hiked every day, no matter what the weather, and we read Irish literature, Irish poets particularly, Seamus Heaney and Patrick Kavanagh and Leanne O'Sullivan among others. And the idea of, again, connecting the literature and the landscape was foremost. Hiking in Ireland is different from England. The weather isn't so much different, but the conditions were different. In England, the trails were pretty clearly marked and having been worn down for a long time. In Ireland, the trails were at times, or the markings were hard to find if they were there at all. But it hardly mattered. There is a particular kind of social joy that you get in Ireland, and a kind of good fellowship among people who are also hiking that made whatever distractions or difficulties seem very small. The hike I want to talk about here is one that goes up a hill called Hungry Hill. It's near the small village of Adrigol, just off the edge of Bantry Bay. And we began hiking, and what seemed to happen a lot is that the weather turned pretty bad. Hail, rain, our lunches were sodden, the wind came up. It was just one of those things that happened. And then just as much as it was awful, it changed. And that's where I want to pick up the story. As quickly as the rain and wind started, they ceased, and the air warmed enough to be noticed. Glee replaced the somberness of our sodden lunch, and the students wanted to push on to our goal, the summit. Our initial joy at the absence of rain and wind gradually shifted to another level of resignation as we navigated among the bogs that had recently been cut for fuel. The sponginess underfoot lapsed into muck, and almost every step had to be calculated to find the least likely soft, wet spot. Frustratingly slow, considered movements eventually landed us on a series of rock faces on the rising cliff, raising spirits with the change. The top of the mountain now visible, I could feel the energy of the group surge, only to be tempered by a very large bog that lay before us, followed by an ascending order of ridges, about 70 feet each before our goal. No one was dry nor unmarked by freely flowing mud now crusting over on our upper bodies. Picking our way for a solid footing became a sort of game. One good foot placement followed by a knee-high sink into the murky ooze. Like some mythic creature, the bog kept trying to suck us in, but the deep fellow feeling among group members now pushed back against the bog as each person simply took a responsibility to help out anyone who was sinking or stuck. One woman, in utter frustration with the slow pace, decided to run across what looked to her to be a field of grass. 5 yards into her run, she sank with a slick slip, high up to the top of her thighs. Finding herself immobilized, she began to panic with the sensation that she was sinking, and cried out for help. Immediately, the students formed a human chain, themselves sinking as they moved. Gathering her under her shoulders, they extracted her from the mud with a whooshing sound, heartening to her ears. Her terror melted into laughter, abetted by her classmates in a wash of emotional support. Back to slow, steady, and safer progress resumed, the climbs over the remaining ridges taking us to our hands and knees. In that moment, I saw another confirmation that important changes had taken place for the students. They understood almost instinctively what had to be done, and they moved without regard for their own comfort. By the time we reached the summit, clouds cleared away. The sun smiled on us, and the vista opened so we could see the land caressing the boundary of Bantry Bay, and the Atlantic stretched to the utter end of the horizon. Compensation for all of our efforts to reach this point seemed to inform the moment. Pictures were taken, laughter was in the air, fist pumps and triumph and bragging rights noted. And something more, the differences among us and the petty irritations inevitable in group efforts were forgotten. Having persisted to our goal in spite of severe conditions, linked us on an emotional level of self-revelation. We encountered and found substance in the wonder of it all. I had the students read Leanne O'Sullivan's Kellic, The Hag of Beara, and as we look at the vista before us, a few of the poems make us feel that we are in them. We are on the Beara Peninsula, and The Hag of Beara is a poem dating back to the 9th century. Leanne O'Sullivan, a native of Beara, reinterprets the ancient poem, creating a mythic rendering of place and character. As we consider the lines from the poem called Meeting Place, the mist rolls from the hills like an airy moss, mottled with heather, and my weather eye is cast to the clouds hanging wildly above us. We can literally see and feel what she describes. A frisson of recognition laces its way among us. The mist, hills, and wild clouds are our immediate reality. The fusion of emotion and gaining our vantage point, I feel, brings us closer together and sets up a receptive awareness. The way each of us experiences the lines of poetry opens a space for our individual, unique understanding of what they mean. In this moment, the discovery of poetry's power to reach the recesses of our being is on us. Links between words and landscapes, like the very rocks we sit on, are visual and tactile. We can see what we feel and feel what we see, reiterating the cosmic duration of time and weathering lines from another poem called Birth Dream. Once I made mountains, carried stones, and earth my apron, and set them in piles along the coast, raised them up like the skin of a healing wound. They are old now, and I am still here, wading the river's clay bed to the lush meadow on the east. It captures the mythic recollection of creation and renders our surroundings with sensual precision and evolving order. With an emphasis on natural and human process in the poem, what might appear to be a desolation in the random scatter of rocks, bogs, and grassy patches before us becomes alive and reassuring. The hag looks forward to the way love will carry her onward, the excitement of discovery lingering ahead like a promise in the movement of time. The success in our overcoming the physical hardship of hiking up to this point serves as a parallel to the poem. The effect of the experiences during the Kipling Hall program are far-reaching, as I mentioned earlier. The program will continue. It's been on hold for 2 years now because of COVID, and Professor Katie Charles, who is taking over, is getting things outlined for her own version of this program. And I think the important thing to keep in mind is that one doesn't have to go to the Lake District or to North Yorkshire to feel what can be felt in that engagement with the natural world, with its difficulties and its rewards. It can really be translated into any landscape, I think. Having said that, though, being in the landscapes that are talked about by poets and novelists brings a certain kind of resonance that make the reading of the poems even more powerful. I'm going to sign off and wish you well. Thank you for being here. Bye now.